when I was suspended from the Labour Party, it was because the Labour MP, John Mann, was saying that I'd said Hitler was a Zionist. 2 years and 4 months later, I'm still reading articles that say I'd said Hitler was a Zionist. And in all these 2 years and 4 months, no journalist has ever phoned me to ask what I actually said.
Well,
what did you say? What did you say?
What I said was that in the 1930s, Hitler supported Zionism, not because he liked the German Jews, but the German Zionist movement signed an agreement with Hitler because they wanted all Germany's Jews to go and live in Palestine and create a Jewish state, and Hitler wanted them all out.
You're dealing in verbal semantics because
when you
say Hitler supported Zionism, it's not a massive reach for listeners who are hearing you say that to believe that you think Hitler was some kind of Zionist, is it?
Hello everyone, that was the voice of ex-Mayor of London, Ken Livingstone, explaining the comments he made that got him suspended from the Labour Party. If you're British, then the chances are you first heard about the relationship between Zionists and Nazis due to the furore over Livingstone's comments. Fellow Labour MP John Mann couldn't contain himself.
Disgusting racist, Livingstone. Disgusting racist. Rewriting history, you're a disgusting racist.
You saying it's not true?
Yes, you're a lying racist.
Really? Why don't you go and check
a Nazi apologist. A Nazi apologist.
Check your history.
A Nazi apologist. You're a disgusting Nazi apologist, Livingstone.
So what's the truth of this? Is the suggestion of any connection between the Zionist movement and the Nazi Party simply an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory? Or did their shared ideological vision, that of a Jew-free Europe, lead to a more formal relationship? That's what I'll be exploring in this episode. Before I get into the details, I'll just examine some of the ideological tensions that are inherent to the Zionist enterprise. It could be said that Zionism is composed of two impulses, which may complement each other, but can also come into stark contradiction. The first impulse is to protect Jewish people from European anti-Semitic violence. This is particularly the case after a resurgence of that violence in 1880s Russia. The caveat is that Zionism is not an effort to protect Jews by any means, but rather through, and only through, the creation of a nation-state. At some point, the goals of protecting Jews and creating that state will inevitably come into conflict with each other. One powerful illustration of this, which I looked at in episode 10, was the murder of Jacob Israel Dahan in the year 1924. Dahan was a Jew, murdered in Palestine by other Jews because his writing threatened the Zionist project. Whilst the killing of one man may seem like a small thing given the level of violence to come, I devoted an episode to it due to it being the killing of a principle. Zionist leader Vladimir Jabotinsky illustrated this when he wrote in his novel The Five that the, quote, moral equilibrium of humanity rests on age-old inhibitions that, though they may retain their power when breached in practice, crumble to dust when challenged in theory. Kill an innocent peddler, and you have killed but an innocent peddler. Ask, but why should killing an innocent peddler be forbidden, and nothing is forbidden anymore? End quote. To rephrase this for the case of Dahan, for a Zionist to kill an innocent Jew may not be of that much consequence, but to ask why it is forbidden to sacrifice Jews in service of Zionism is to go to a place where nothing is forbidden. Where might that lead in practice? Let's take a moment to look at the situation facing Jews in Germany after Adolf Hitler became Chancellor in January 1933. The Nazi Party took 44% of the vote in the March 5th elections, putting them in full control of Germany. The party had been churning out anti-Semitic propaganda for years, blaming Germany's less than 1% Jewish population for both the loss of the First World War and the country's economic woes. Hitler's infamous 1925 book, Mein Kampf, contains passages which reveal a genocidal intent. He saw Jews as akin to germs, writing that, quote, the nationalization of our masses will succeed only when, aside from all the positive struggle for the soul of our people, their international poisoners are exterminated. End quote. Regarding the war, he wrote, quote, if at the beginning of our war and during the war 12 or 15,000 of these Hebrew corrupters of the nation had been subjected to poison gas, such as had been endured in the fields by hundreds of thousands of our very best German workers of all classes and professions, then the sacrifice of millions at the front would not have been in vain." End quote. Persecution of Jews was not a new thing in Germany. It had been a prominent feature of the country throughout the 1920s, with businesses being boycotted and Jews being denied employment and barred from many restaurants and hotels. During the early 30s, Nazi brown shirts physically prevented customers from entering Jewish-owned stores, whilst they broke windows and threatened the owners. All of this escalated after the Nazis fully came to power. Within 5 days of their election victory, SA stormtroopers rioted, attacking Jewish businesses, with Hermann Goering announcing that, quote, "I shall employ the police, and without mercy, wherever German people are hurt, but I refuse to turn the police into a guard for Jewish stores." End quote. Germany's largest Jewish organization issued a statement that, quote, "In meetings and certain newspapers, violence against Jews is propagated. The spirit of hatred now directed against the Jews will not halt there. It will spread and poison the soul of the German people." End quote. Many Western leaders saw the Nazis as a bulwark against a communist Germany, and were therefore reluctant to condemn them. It was then left to Jewish groups around the world to decide how to respond. What ensued was one of the most interesting, yet rarely mentioned, events in history. An international effort formed to remove the Nazis from power through a non-violent boycott of German goods. On March 12th, the American Jewish Congress voted to commence a national program of highly visible protests, parades, and demonstrations. 55,000 people would attend an anti-Nazi rally in New York on March the 27th. The Vice President of the Congress, Dr. Joseph Tenenbaum, said that, quote, "Germany is not a speck on Mars. It is a civilized country, located in the heart of Europe, relying on friendly cooperation and commercial intercourse with the nations of the world. A bellum Judaicum, war against the Jews, means boycott, ruin, disaster, the end of all German resources, and the end of all hope for the rehabilitation of Germany, whose friends we have not ceased to be. May God save Germany from such a national calamity." End quote. Of the 3 big Jewish organizations in the United States, the American Jewish Congress supported protests and boycotts, whilst the American Jewish Committee and B'nai B'rith opposed it. They were legitimately concerned that this course of action could make things worse for Jews in Germany. Then, on March the 19th, Jewish war veterans, who had fought Germany before, instigated a national boycott of all German goods, services, and shipping lines. This could be considered the very first international effort to oppose Hitler. The Jewish War Veterans Charter read that it existed, quote, "to combat the sources of bigotry and darkness, wherever originating and whatever their target, to uphold the fair name of the Jew and fight his battle wherever unjustly assailed." End quote. A report from Germany published in the New York Times read, quote, "One can find no words to describe the fear and despair, the tragedy that envelops the German Jews. They are being beaten, terrorized, murdered, and compelled to keep quiet. The Hitler regime flames up with an anger because it has been forced through fear of foreign public opinion to forgo a mass slaughter. It threatens, however, to execute big pogroms if Jews in other countries make too much fuss about the pogroms it has hitherto indulged in." End quote. The Nazi regime was deeply concerned about the potential of an international boycott. This was not the entrenched Romanov dynasty of Russia. Their power was dependent upon them delivering the promised boost to the German economy, where 1 in 4 people were currently unemployed. Joseph Goebbels wrote in his diary that, quote, "The horrors propaganda abroad gives us much trouble. The many Jews who have left Germany have set all foreign countries against us. We are defenselessly exposed to the attacks of our adversaries." End quote. The following day, the veterans were joined by Polish Jews, who instigated their own boycott. They turned this into a wider movement by incorporating the issue of the Polish corridor, which Hitler had threatened to occupy. As early as March 23rd, the New York Times ran the headline, quote, "Protest on Hitler growing in nation. Christian and non-sectarian groups voice indignation over anti-Jewish drive. Urge Washington to act." and boycott movement spreads, merchants cancelling orders for German goods, end quote. German steamships immediately felt the effect with cancelled bookings. Jewish firms cancelled orders for German goods. In Britain, the Archbishop of Liverpool urged Catholics to join the protest. The Jewish war veterans established an office to connect American merchants with alternative suppliers of goods. 2 New Jersey companies rescinded orders for hundreds of thousands of dollars of German products. In response to this, the Nazis instigated their own boycott of Jewish goods in Germany. Being economically illiterate, they failed to foresee what an own goal this would be. Closing down Jewish-owned factories and department stores only served to worsen German unemployment. Unsurprisingly, uneducated brown-shirt thugs were unable to run these businesses when they stepped in. Boycotting Jews also obviously caused a massive loss in tax revenue, and the smashed windows of Jewish stores had to be replaced by Aryan insurance companies. In Berlin, nearly 3/4 of doctors and lawyers were Jewish. You can see the problem here. It was estimated that had this boycott lasted 2 weeks, it would have thrown 1 million Germans out of work. Heightened Nazi persecution also only served to expand the boycott of Germany internationally. I'll just bullet point some of the international boycott's effects. For the first half of 1933, German exports dropped by 51%. Bear in mind the boycott only began in late March. The German fur industry is estimated to have lost $100 million in 1933 alone. Bosch lost the entirety of its South American market. IG Farben described the effect as producing an extraordinary slump. England supplanted Germany as the largest exporter to Denmark and Norway. The diamond industry, which employed 5,000 workers, faced total collapse, as Antwerp's mostly Jewish diamond merchants refused to deal with Germany. The shipping industry, including transatlantic passenger travel, was almost bankrupted. Foreign endowments to German universities declined by 95%. Germany witnessed mass corporate flight as European and American companies withdrew from the country. By June, the Reich Bank's gold and foreign exchange reserves were down to half of what they had been the previous year. By the 5th of August, the Investors' Review was reporting that authoritative opinion has it that Hitlerism will come to a sanguinary end before the new year. The boycotters almost universally adopted the slogan, "Germany will crack this winter." Let's look now at Zionism's relationship to anti-Semitism generally and Nazism specifically. The Zionist movement has always recognized that it is fueled by anti-Semitism. They are two sides of the same coin. Any efforts to aid the integration of Jews into their nation-states is therefore necessarily an anathema to Zionism. Theodor Herzl recognized this when he said that, quote, "The anti-Semites will become our most dependable friends. The anti-Semitic countries are allies," end quote. Philosopher and Zionist Jacob Klatskin took this position to its next logical step, writing that, quote, "Instead of establishing societies for defense against the anti-Semites who want to reduce our rights, we should establish societies for defense against our friends who desire to defend our rights," end quote. This attitude persists to this day. In 2016, when a conference aimed at restarting Palestine-Israel peace talks was held in Paris, Israeli Defense Minister Avigdor Lieberman said, quote, "Perhaps it is time to tell the Jews of France, this isn't your country, this isn't your land. Leave France and come to Israel," end quote. How does this template fit with the rise of the Nazis? Tony Greenstein, author of the book Zionism During the Holocaust, writes that, quote, "As early as April 1933, the Zionist Federation of Germany announced its determination to take advantage of the crisis to win over a traditionally assimilationist German Jewry to Zionism," end quote. The Federation's membership grew rapidly. By October, one of its members stated that, quote, "The most valuable elements of German Jewry are moving very clearly and deliberately towards us," end quote, and that the Zionist movement, quote, "finally has been called to lead German Jewry in these times, and to influence decisively the reshaping of Jewish life in Germany," end quote. The Nazis also observed that Zionism was replacing assimilationism amongst German Jews. Many leading Nazis hated the Zionists. Hitler thought they were also responsible for the loss of the war due to the Balfour Declaration, but there was a marriage of convenience to be had. Rabbi Joachim Prinz, a prominent German Zionist leader, said, quote, "It was morally disturbing to seem to be considered as the favoured children of the Nazi government, particularly when it dissolved the anti-Zionist youth groups and seemed in other ways to prefer the Zionists. The Nazis asked for a more Zionist behaviour." End quote. Nahum Bialik, the famous poet who penned In the City of Slaughter after the Kishinev pogrom, said that, quote, "Hitlerism has perhaps saved German Jewry, which was being assimilated into annihilation." End quote. On the 21st of June, the Zionist Federation of Germany sent a memo directly to Adolf Hitler, which read in part, quote, "Our acknowledgement of Jewish nationality provides for a clear and sincere relationship to the German people and its national and racial realities, precisely because we don't wish to falsify these fundamentals, because we too are against mixed marriages and are for maintaining the purity of the Jewish group. The realization of Zionism could only be hurt by resentment of Jews abroad against the German development. Boycott propaganda is in essence fundamentally un-Zionist, because Zionism wants not to do battle, but to convince and to build." End quote. The memo was never answered, but for many years Zionist groups remained exempt from the general ban on Jewish groups. This brings us to the Havara Agreement. Havara is the Hebrew word for transfer, and in this context it refers to the trade agreement reached between the Zionist executive and the Nazis over the summer of 1933. Zionists were aware that many middle-class German Jews would be willing to leave Germany for Palestine if only they could get their wealth out. The problem was that the German government forbade any citizen from transferring assets outside of the country. The Zionists proposed that Jews relocating to Palestine should be allowed to keep their assets if a percentage of them was spent on German goods. This provided the Zionist movement with access to both immigrant labour as well as a heavy injection of German economic support. For the Nazis, it had three effects. Firstly, Palestine itself provided a market for German goods. While small, Edwin Black, author of the Transfer Agreement, the dramatic pact between the Third Reich and Jewish Palestine, writes that, quote, "While this tiny corner of the Middle East by 1933 accounted for only 0.1% of Germany's overall exports, it was a disproportionately important customer for certain vital Reich industries such as fertilizer, farm equipment, and irrigation pipes." End quote. Secondly, Palestine could be used to circumnavigate the blockade in the Middle East. Black writes that, quote, "Far beyond its own consumption, however, Palestine was now the crucial gateway to expanding German exports throughout the emerging Mid-East market. This market was deemed essential by the Reich if certain strategic raw materials Hitler craved for war were to be acquired via bilateral trade agreements." End quote. Finally, and perhaps by far the most important factor, was that the Zionists broke the unity of the blockade. Black describes two aspects to this. Firstly, if Jewish groups were not united in support of boycotting Germany, they would not be able to win sufficient non-Jewish support. Absent this, the boycott would not be sufficient to break the Nazi regime. This is why the Nazis leaked details of the Havara Agreement at the first opportunity. This resulted in headlines reading, "Nazis report deal with Palestine" in the New York Times, and "Palestine trades with Nazis" in the Palestine Post. You can imagine how helpful this was with those attempting to build international solidarity with the non-Jewish world. Secondly, the boycott had advanced from the bottom up, with many different groups, Jewish and non-Jewish, joining it in an uncoordinated manner. Black writes that what the Nazis feared most was a coordinated global operation. He writes that the problem of an uncoordinated boycott is that it is limited by the merchant's inability to locate new suppliers. In a short time, this will hurt the merchant. What was needed, then, was an organization capable of connecting merchants with new suppliers. Black writes that, quote, "By 1933, commerce had become so international and complex that only a global organization could fundamentally shift commercial traffic over and around the well-entrenched German export system. The boycott organizers understood this from the beginning. These organizers knew that boycotts become successful not by asking people to stop buying and selling what they have traditionally bought and sold, but by asking people to switch their buying and selling loyalties. New loyalties, once rooted, will become equally difficult to dislodge. Without high-quality, price-competitive alternative sources of supply, the anti-Hitler boycott will be no more than an emotional, briefly punitive, commercial reprisal. But with an international clearinghouse to reroute the rivers of commerce, Germany will be left deserted and destitute, not just for a few months, as she weathered the attack, but in a systemic fashion that would remain in force until Germany collapsed from within." End quote. It was anticipated that the World Jewish Congress in September of 1933 would establish just such an international boycott. At the crucial moment, however, it failed to do so. Such a boycott would have either ended the Zionist-Nazi agreement or forced the wider Jewish world to extend the boycott to the Zionist movement. Black writes that the committee members were forced to choose between being good Jews and being good Zionists, and chose the latter. The St. Louis Jewish Weekly Modern View reported that, quote, "After considerable debate and argument, the Resolution Committee of the World Jewish Congress brought in a report which failed to proclaim a world Jewish boycott against Germany, but which endorsed the instinctive and spontaneous resort to boycott which already exists." End quote. It must be noted that the Zionist movement itself was bitterly divided over Havara. Vladimir Jabotinsky's revisionist party was utterly opposed to any alliance with the Nazis. In a speech given at the 18th Zionist Congress, where Havara was debated, Jabotinsky said, quote, "The present Congress is duty-bound to put the Jewish problem in Germany before the entire world. We are conducting a war with murderers. We must destroy, destroy, destroy them, not only with the boycott, but politically, supporting all existing forces against them to isolate Germany from the civilized world." End quote. It was the Labour Zionists who pushed the agreement through, owing to their political majority. They even went so far as to introduce a resolution banning anyone in the Zionist organization from, quote, "conducting foreign policy, contacting foreign governments or the League of Nations, or engaging in any activities of a political nature that infringe on the prerogatives of the Zionist executive." End quote. Edwin Black writes that this outlawed all forms of anti-Nazi protest, including campaigning against the transfer agreement. The Zionist justification for Havara was and is humanitarian. They were helping as many Jews as they could escape the Nazis. This position doesn't hold up to examination. Of the over 200,000 Jews who came to Palestine from 1933 to 9, only 52,000 were German, and of them only 20,000 came via Havara. In Zionism during the Holocaust, Tony Greenstein claims that these were relatively wealthy Jews who would have found refuge elsewhere. Havara was about extracting German Jewish wealth for the benefit of Zionism. It's also the case that 2/3 of all German Jews who applied to take part in Havara were turned down by the Zionists in favor of more suitable settlers from the US and UK. Zionist organizations applied none of their considerable resources to finding safe havens for Jews anywhere other than in Palestine. Worse, they resisted efforts to do so, seeing it as competition. British Colonial Secretary Malcolm MacDonald expressed disbelief when Zionists objected to a plan to transport 9,000 German Jewish children to England after Kristallnacht. David Ben-Gurion Green's attitude is instructive. Quote, "If I knew it was possible to save all the Jewish children of Germany by their transfer to England, and only half of them by transferring them to Eretz Israel, I would choose the latter, because we are faced not only with the accounting of these children, but also with the historical accounting of the Jewish people." End quote. Regarding the economic benefits to Zionism, Edwin Black writes that, quote, "The Havara brought in many of the fundamentals: coal, iron, cement, fertilizer, seed, hammers, saws, and cultivators. Havara also brought in the capital: cash, loans, mortgages, deposits, and credits. All of this produced an economic explosion in Jewish Palestine, requiring companies to be formed, investments to be made, and most of all, jobs to be filled. Palestine's economic absorbativeness tripled, perhaps quadrupled, within a year or so of the transfer agreement." End quote. Black further states that Havara led to Jewish Palestine becoming vital to Nazi economic strategy, driving a stake through the heart of the boycott. The winter of 1933 was bleak in Germany, with a possibility of starvation looming. The Nazi regime, however, organised a winter relief effort and clung to power. In the United States, Samuel Untermyer founded the non-sectarian Anti-Nazi League to coordinate the boycott. But Black writes, quote, "But it was too late. It was just too late. It had all taken too long. By the time Untermeyer's organised boycott was skeletally in place, winter had arrived. Too much time had been lost. The crucial late summer, fall, and early winter German exports had not been sufficiently disrupted to have an impact during the brunt of the cold winter months. Untermeyer's people tried, but they just couldn't do it in time. Many had perceived the coming defeat even before the final campaign began on September 10th, but they had to try. They were ultimately forced to accept the awesome reality. Germany did not crack that winter." End quote. Although not breaking the Nazis, Black writes about the incredible effect the boycott did have. Quote, "The indefatigable work of Untermeyer and other champions of the boycott kept recovery out of Hitler's reach. It forced the Third Reich to vigilantly restrain anti-Jewish violence in Germany, since each incident helped intensify the anti-Nazi movement. In its first years, the boycott also helped prevent Hitler from carrying out his vow to conquer Europe. Plagued by boycott and antagonistic trade barriers, and continually denied foreign exchange, the Reich was for years unable to acquire the raw materials needed to rebuild its war machine. Hitler was repeatedly forced to push back his war timetables." End quote. It is extremely appealing to think that a Jewish-led non-violent boycott would have brought down the Third Reich and prevented the Second World War. For anti-Zionists, it may be equally as appealing to reflect on the irony of Zionism facilitating the Holocaust. I really wouldn't be able to put any weight on this conclusion, however. We would need another Earth with an alternative timeline, one where Zionists didn't break the boycott, to know if it could have been effective. In this podcast, I've been heavily reliant on the research of Edwin Black. This is an area of history that does not seem to have been as well covered as it deserves. I suspect because both the Zionist enterprise and Western interventionist imperialism rests upon certain narratives of the Second World War remaining unquestioned. Black's critics allege that he is too reliant on perceptions of the German economy, and that the Nazis were far too entrenched and the boycott far too limited in scope to ever have had a real chance of working. What is undeniably true, however, is that people at the time, both Nazi and anti-Nazi, realistically believed that a boycott could bring down the Nazi regime, as well as limiting the persecution of German Jews. The Zionist movement leveraged that boycott, not for humanitarian reasons, but to build the future state of Israel. It is for reasons such as this that the veteran Middle East journalist Alan Hart referred to Zionism not as the worst enemy of the Palestinians, which it undoubtedly is, but as the worst enemy of the Jews. Thank you for listening. In this episode, I've drawn heavily on Tony Greenstein's book, Zionism During the Holocaust, as well as Edwin Black's The Transfer Agreement. In the next episode, I'll look at how Zionism embraced terrorism in the 1930s and 40s as a prelude to establishing the State of Israel. The fully footnoted book for the first 10 episodes of this series is available from my website, and I will update that as the series goes along. Any donations to keep this series going are greatly appreciated, and my Buy Me a Coffee details are in the info box. Thank you.